Christoph, are you online? Christoph?
Raul?
Yes.
Okay, I'm online. So
what was the title of your talk at the end, just to be sure?
Here, classical higher logic, automation and selected applications.
Okay, classical high order logic, automation and selected applications. Okay.
But the slides are online now. Everything's fine. My voice is okay, and
okay. Just to be sure, when Ulises says that we are online, just be sure to check that your slides are visible. Okay.
Yeah, I can't see. I just have my full screen now. You have to tell me whether you see them or not. I cannot check whether they are displayed.
Okay, they say that we are live. So welcome everybody. Welcome to this 2021 edition of the National Colloquium on Artificial Intelligence. And I'm very happy that for the talk today, we have a new topic, something that we have not covered in the past. And we have also an expert on that topic, which is automation of logic. So Christoph Benzmüller, he obtained his degree in computer science from Saarland University in Germany, also his PhD. And then there is another degree after the PhD in Germany, which is called the Habilitation. He obtained his Habilitation also in Saarland in 2007. And afterwards, he has been a professor at different universities. He was a full professor for formal methods and artificial intelligence at the University of Brussels in Germany. He has been a Heisenberg Fellow from the National Research Association in Germany. He has been an invited professor at Stanford. He has been a professor in Luxembourg. And currently he's a professor of computer science at the University of Berlin. And he also is a scientific advisor for a company in Berlin, developing automation solutions for artificial intelligence. So that's a long introduction, but Christoph is going to talk to us today about classical higher order logic and how to automate that and which tools are available. And I should mention also that he has been the world champion in automated deduction several times with his Leo system. And he will also mention that system in his talk. So without further ado, I give you Christoph.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a pleasure actually to be able to present this work here. Also, thank you to the organizers, Raul, for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to present this work here. Well, I have a tough plan for today, for the next 50 minutes of this presentation, and I give you here a short overview. First, I actually should have said something in the beginning about this quote, because that is a motivational part of my work and has been for a long time. It says here, you see it's by Leibniz, we have it, a characteristica universalis. We should be able to reason in metaphysics and morals in much the same way as in geometry and analysis. So the talk is about classical higher logic, but I will also point to this idea of in direction of universal logical reasoning, and that will make some part in the end of this presentation. You see it here. The main part of the presentation will be this the second part here, classical higher logic, after a short motivational and own position part in the very beginning. So that will be the main part of this presentation, introduction to the notion of classical higher logic, and also talking about automation aspects. But then I briefly motivate also this area of non-classical logic. So why classical logic is not enough and why there is a need for non-classical logic. But then I come back and say, oh, well, but maybe this classical higher logic is already rich enough so that I can actually provide a universal logical reasoning approach. And then I can actually come up with a statement and explain you that classical logic is already eventually sufficiently expressive. And then in the end, I will go and point to different application directions. Here I've picked out ethical legal governance systems for artificial intelligence. So very briefly, my own position, since I've entered the field of AI, this has been my personal view, a symbiosis between techniques from symbolic and subsymbolic AI. It just happened to be the case that I ended up mainly in the area of symbolic artificial intelligence. Now, for persons that are long, let's say, familiar with the area of AI, it might be a bit kind of interesting to see that we currently have a very strong hype on the side of subsymbolic AI technology. Of course, there's a good justification. There are excellent successes on the side of subsymbolic techniques, machine learning, neural networks. And you see nowadays you even have them celebrated in blockbuster movies. But on the other hand, you have also excellent successes on the side of symbolic AI. We shouldn't forget about them. For instance, many of you might not even be aware of that we have in the last couple of years solved open mathematical problems with set solving technology. So solvers for propositional logic. And of course, they are not celebrated to the same extent, and we don't have movies about those successes yet. Here's another interesting story that brings me now closer to the topic of this talk. I give it very briefly here. It's not so relevant, but it's a kind of transfer story that's quite interesting. So there's Kepler's conjecture, or meanwhile theorem. Kepler conjectured this 400 years ago. So it's a statement, if you reduce this to the three-dimensional space, about the optimal configuration of cannonballs, or you see here oranges in the three-dimensional space, and this is the pyramid. This conjecture was proved in 89 by Thomas Hales, and he came up with a 300-page proof manuscript that contained code and also data. Why that? Because he worked a lot with computer algebra systems, and that was part of the proof. So he submitted that to the Annals of Mathematics. There was a board formed of referees that were supposed to review the paper, but then happened something, I think that was for the first time in history, that humankind gave up on reviewing that paper. So they couldn't verify it all, only part of it, only an introductory part of it. So Thomas Hales wasn't happy with that. He created the FlySpec project, and he completed that in 2014. And the result is a formal verification of that proof he delivered in a proof assistance system. And I consider them as systems between formal logic, AI, and mathematics. Well, that was very much interactive work that went into this piece of maths here. In the end, an estimation of about 30 person-years. But there's work in the area now on combining automated theorem proving and let it be assisted by techniques from machine learning. And with such techniques, we can show now already that you can automate about 65, maybe meanwhile even more, of the proofs that were interactively constructed. And I think there's room for way more improvements in this area if we better integrate these techniques from both sides. So that brings me back to this picture here. I think that is what we need to pay more attention at, namely the integration of techniques from the subsymbolic and the symbolic side, because then we can actually combine the pros from both areas: correlation, patterns, robustness, learning on the side of subsymbolic AI techniques, and dealing with causalities, abstraction, precise reasoning, and explain and verifiability, so precise explanations, rational explanations in the area of symbolic AI. My own research is now as follows. So since more than 2 decades, I'm actually working on the automation of higher order logic. So I'm the father, so to say, of a series of provers called Leo provers. Meanwhile, we have three childs of those kinds. And I'm also was also active together with Jeff Sutcliffe and others to set up the TPTP infrastructure for higher order automated theorem proving, so that we have common languages that the theorem provers speak, so we can have benchmarks and comparisons and so on. I was also interested from the beginning in this area of proof assistance systems, which I just motivated. Kepler's conjecture success story in this area. And in particular, in this challenge to combine interaction, human interaction, and automation in these systems. And for a long time, I have been looking mainly at traditional applications myself. So that's this kind of idea of formal methods in mathematics, in computer science, and artificial intelligence. But more recently, last 10 years probably, I was looking now more and more into this area or this idea of universal logical reasoning in Hall. And that is what I will be talking about in the second part of the presentation. And that opens up a field of a complete area of new potential applications. So for instance, what we did, we looked into computational metaphysics, or I looked with a team of students in foundational topics in math. So for instance, encoding of category theory in the computer. And in this talk, I will talk, in the end, I outline a little bit these ideas in direction of ethical and legal reasoning in computers. Well, let's dive into this main part of the talk. That will be the longest part, classical hierarchical logic. The other ones I have to keep a bit shorter. Well, classical hierarchical logic is quite expressive. You see it here. I've made a slide where I want to point you now to in comparison with first order logic. So this is something you can still do in first order logic, and this is quantification over individuals. Here's a formula for all x, p of f of x. So when x is supposed to range over individual objects, p is a predicate symbol, f is a function symbol, constant symbols. But now in higher order logic, you're way more expressive. You can quantify, for instance, over function symbols. We have here a quantifier over this function f. We can also quantify over predicate symbols. An example here. If you build in higher order logic on top of the lambda calculus, many of you probably know about the area of functional programming and probably have seen lambda calculus. If you build in higher order logic on top of the lambda calculus, as we will do later on, then you can also introduce unnamed functions. The representation here of the identity function, lambda x, x. So give me an x, return the x. Or unnamed predicates, here the predicate of being self-identical. Give me an object and check whether it is self-identical. You can have elegant statements about function, predicate, sets, relations, and so on. So for instance, here you have a predicate that you apply to the equivalence relation here, the equivalence symbol. And you can define, give this predicate reflexive, then an elegant definition. Reflexive just takes an relation as an argument and then checks whether for all x are of xx. So the obvious thing here. This is very powerful, in particular, if you combine those features. Well, we know that this language is now so rich enough that if you don't add types, that you can easily run into problems, because you can encode now paradoxes, and you have then problems with inconsistencies in the language. So for instance, without a notion of types added to that language, you can easily encode the Russell paradox, the set of all sets which don't contain themselves. So we add a simple notion of types, and that is preventing some of those paradoxes and inconsistencies. Here's an example that I want to present. That is a classic example, but it's still quite interesting, I think, in particular for community who have never seen classical hierarchical logic. This is Cantas' theorem, and I want to show you how elegantly you can formulate it in a higher order logic, like the one I've motivated. So the theorem says there's no surjective map from a set to its power set. So here I have a set in red. I have objects. I name them 1, 2, 3, be it the natural numbers, be it some other objects. The x is ranging over that set. Okay. Then I have here the power set of that set in red. So the elements of the set F are subsets of the set in red. So for instance, here I have a subset containing just the 1, or you have another one, there's another one, and so on. So this is the power set of the red set. And then the statement here says that there is no surjective mapping G, so that for all elements in that set F, there exists an X in the red set, so that G, when applied to X, gives you that F. So there's no surjective mapping. This can be elegantly stated in that language, and we can also add type information. So for instance, the X would be now of some individual type I, and this here would be now of a predicate type, the power set I to O, because it's characterizing the subsets over that domain here, the red domain. And you can do that with, consider these as predicates. So we associate predicates with sets, or characteristic functions with the sets they describe. And the G has then the obvious type from I to that predicate type. Well, you can also, and I do that now here, show the proof of that statement. And you can elegantly actually prove that in theorem provers. I come to that in a second. Let's do the proof very quickly. Assume there is a surjective G. So the proof is by contradiction. So we first assume that there is such a surjective G, and we will bring that to a contradiction. And then that is the very essential step here. Consider now the following choice for F, a diagonal set construction. F is the set of all objects X that are not element of G of X. Okay? That is the Eureka choice in the proof. Because now you can argue that there must be an A such that G of A gives you that F. This is because we have assumed that G is surjective. But now check for this here. When we now ask the question whether A is actually an element of G of A, then this means the following. A is an element of G of A is of course the same as asking the question whether A is an element of F, because we have this equality here. But this here, if you now unfold the definition of F and apply it, you see that this is then saying that A is not an element of G of A. This is simply by exploiting this definition of the diagonal set. And this is, of course, a contradiction. A is an element of G of A, if and only if it's not an element of G of A, contradiction. So there cannot be such a surjective mapping. Higher order theorem provers can very effectively solve these problems for decades. And you see here one of the first papers was mentioning and explaining a proof where you can read about it. In our Leo provers, this works by a combination of heuristic guessing, or kind of guessing, and straightforward resolution and higher order unification. You have to guess a little bit of this Eureka instance, the Eureka set here, the diagonal set. You have to guess this leading negation symbol, the not symbol. The rest can then easily be synthesized from the context by resolution and unification. And I will motivate it a little bit more. We can't dive fully into that proof here, but I show you others and you get the idea. Here's another motivating example I want to present in this presentation. And this is Bullock's Juris inference. There's a paper which you might consult to read more about it. But it's also very interesting and makes an important point. The first three axioms you see here, it's completely stated in first order logic. So there's no higher order quantifier here. It's all quantification over individual or numbers in this case. The first three axioms characterize the Ackermann function. That's a very fast growing function. Some of you might know that, hyper-exponential function. Then you have a statement here, an arbitrary predicate D holds for 1. And then you have another statement here that says if D holds for X, then it also holds for the successor of X. So S is standing here for the successor function. And now you want to prove that D holds for a very large number. That's, of course, quite obvious. And people who know about first order resolution or prologue and so on, they know that you just have to go through many, many modus ponens steps to show that. But Ackermann function phi5 is now such a large number that it's bigger than there are atoms in the universe. So no system whatsoever can eventually come up with that proof. Even if you're here in a nice first order setting or even in a decidable fragment of first order logic, that doesn't buy you much because that are simply too many steps. So there is a proof in first order logic, but this is practically infeasible unless you add induction or unless you add further axioms or so on. But if you give that same set of axioms here to a higher order prover, then you can exploit that there is comprehension supported and so on in the system natively, and that you can now actually introduce powerful key lemmata as instances of comprehension principles. And then with these lemmata you introduce by the machinery of higher order logic, you can easily give a proof on a single page. So Bullock starts that in his paper. It's very interesting because it tells you that story here, that if you lower the expressivity of your logic, then you might have to go for longer proofs. And if you have a very expressive logic, then you might have very elegant and short proofs, because you have more language features at hand at which you can characterize mathematical structures in this case here. So that means there is hope to find that proof also on computers in higher order logic. But if you go into the better behaved logic in first order, in this case here, there wouldn't be hope for that, not without further additions. So let me give you further examples here that are interesting. So sets and relations are naturally inbuilt in classical higher order logic. So for instance, here is the set of all x which have property p and property q. So the set of all x, so that p of x and q of x. And that we simply represent in higher order by this lambda term here. Lambda x, p of x, and q of x. So you can apply that now to objects, and it then checks whether p of x holds and q of x holds. So that is a characterization for that set here, and characteristic function for that set. So that tells you also how we represent element to it. So it takes an argument and it takes a set and it applies the set, the predicate, the characteristic function of that set to the element, and evaluation then tells you whether this results to true or false, or whether the x is in M or not. And so on. Now you can introduce, for instance, the intersection operation simply as this term, lambda m, lambda n. So take two sets as arguments and return the set of all x that so that m of x holds and n of x holds. Or you can read it as element with x is in m and x is in n. And so on and so on. You get the idea, I guess. So that's an advantage. So that means axiomatization of sets can usually be avoided in Holl because you have this very native built-in support for reasoning about sets via characteristic functions. And this is very useful, and I exploit that in the universal logical reasoning approach I'm going to show you later. Now let me more concretely introduce the syntax of Holl, I assume here. So we have a simple notion of types. I motivated types earlier on, and we typically have a base type I for individuals, arbitrary base type of individuals. The only restriction we have here is non-emptiness. And we have this other base type O, the type of Boolean. So that is actually now really constrained. So it assumes that it's bivalent. So we have just two elements in here, true and false, and exactly those two elements. And then we build up function types over this base type. So the type I to I to O, the predicate types, and the function types you have already seen. And then, of course, further types. You have also seen a more complex type already for the mapping G early on. Now, as I said, as I say here in brackets, we may also add further base types. So that's conservative extension of that language. That gives you kind of notion of sorts, if you like. So now the language of Holl, we start now with the simply type lambda calculus with constant symbols. So that means we have in our basic language construction now on the way of defining classical higher logic, simply type lambda calculus with constants. That means we have type constant symbols, we have type variable symbols, we have type constrained lambda abstraction. So lambda x alpha s beta gives you a term of function type alpha to beta, and we have function application. So if you have, for instance, such a lambda abstraction term of alpha to beta and you apply it to an argument term t alpha, then that gives you, then this entire term has an type beta. So this entire application construction has type beta. And you see it here already, I motivated it. Abstraction and application, of course, interact. So here you have an example, lambda x p of x as a lambda abstraction applied to an argument term t goes via beta reduction to p of t. People familiar with functional programming, of course, have seen all that. Now we're ready to introduce the logic, classical higher logic, on top of this construction you have seen here. So we simply add special constant to the signature. So special constant symbols which get a fixed interpretation. Negation symbol of this type here from Booleans to Booleans, or the disjunctions which takes a Boolean and then takes another Boolean and returns a Boolean, and so on. This is a special one. That's a constant symbol for universal quantification. And that's another interesting feature of higher order logic. I explain it. I try to explain it very briefly. So that constant symbol pi allows us now to introduce universal quantification without introducing another binding mechanism. So we don't need to introduce a universal for all x binder or existential binder. They are difficult to deal with. We have already a binder, the lambda abstraction. So we introduce this symbol pi, and the pi works as follows. If you apply it to a set characterized as here, the set of all x which have for which S holds, and you give this pi operation the semantics that it checks whether this set is the set of all objects of this type alpha, then you're intuitively doing exactly what universal quantification do. You check whether this set is the set of all objects that have property S. So you can just take for all x as O as an abbreviation or shorthand for this construction with the pi. That's very, very powerful and useful. And then we can introduce further symbols as defined on top of these base choices. For instance, the existential quanta XO stands then for not for all x, not SO. So HOL is a language of terms, and terms of type O are then called formulas. We have no double inductive structure as you have in first order logic. So first introduce terms, and then in a second inductive layer introduce formulas. It's actually a much simpler construction. And here you have now an example of the theorem I gave you earlier. According to the language we've introduced on the previous slide, it would be represented like this here. Yeah? The existential quantifier would be mapped to the universal one, as we have seen, and the universal one is just shorthand for this pi notation. That is, of course, not intuitive for the humans. Therefore, this is only typical internal presentation, for instance, of our Leo provers. But systems you interact with offer you a better interface. Isabel Holt system has, for instance, a wonderful interface, and you can input your formulas like you see them here. So very intuitive reading. And you just need to provide a little bit of type information. The rest is then automatically inferred. And also the proof you have seen earlier, we can't dive now here into the details, but I want to just show you that you can very concisely encode in the system and then have the steps verified and checked automatically. That's exactly what we do here. And here in this line, you see actually the introduction of the diagonal element. Okay, so something about the semantics. HOL with standard semantics is, of course, incomplete. We know that from Gödel's seminal work. But HOL with Henkin's general semantics, an alternative proposal by Henkin, is actually semi-decidable, just like first order, and it's compact, just like first order. Henkin just proposes a more flexible construction for models. Function spaces don't need to be full, as in standard semantics. That gives you more model structures, but it means fewer valid formulas, of course, because you evaluate valid formulas against all the model structures you are studying. So you have now more model structures. But if you do that, important principles are still valid, even though you lose a few statements here. So you have fewer valid formulas, but the essential principles you're after in a classical logic setting are still valid in with respect to Henkin's general models. And in practice, in mathematics and practical application areas in mathematics, if you don't do meta-mathematics, you would hardly notice the difference between Henkin and standard semantics anyway. So comprehension principles are valid in Henkin's general semantics. Boolean extensionality is valid, functional extensionality. Boolean extensionality comes later again. It says for all P and for all Q, if P and Q are equivalent, then they are equal. And functional extensionality tells you that if two functions are pointwise equal, then they are equal. So important to note that, of course, any proof we find for a notion of Henkin semantics is, of course, also a proof for a notion of standard semantics. We just are valid with respect to even more model structures, but including all the standard ones, of course. And if you want to know more about that, here's some suggested reading. Original paper, there's the papers about Henkin's general semantics. I also recommend the papers by Peter Andrews, and then some further papers on extensionality and intentionality. All appeared in JSL. So there's now here a landscape or an overview of some higher order automated theorem provers that are currently available. So you see since 2008, when we started to develop the infrastructure for higher order automated theorem proving, there were then systems joining. Since 2010, we have roughly one system on average joining here the landscape per year. And now you have famous systems joining like CVC4 or Vampire, leading systems in the first order setting. The best system at the moment in the higher order category is Cyberpin. So that's the current world champion. Last year, we were also in one of the categories ahead with the Leo 3 system, and we hope that we can stay competitive. And the earlier systems, also Leo 2 system was already one of the leading systems in 2010 or 11, when I remember correctly. So there are also model finders available, Nitpick and Nunchaku, and proof assistants as I motivated them. For instance, the Isabel system, you might know, developed in Munich and in Cambridge, or Hall 4 in Cambridge, Hall Light by John Harris, and PVS system by Shankar in at SRI, and so on. The famous Cox system, the new Lean system developed in Carnegie Mellon and elsewhere, and so on. Now, some example on resolution here, resolution style theorem proving. With that, I want to dive a little bit further into the particular challenges of automating higher order reasoning. So here an example conjecture. This is a made-up conjecture to make a point about a particular problem in higher order automation of higher order logic. The statement says, for all x, there exists an h. You see that is of individual type. The h is of function type, such that p of h of f of x implies p of f of h of x. And the f have function type, and the p is just a predicate of over type I. And you see here just the order of the f and the h is reversed. So those two functions are reversed, and the one is an existentially quantified one, the h. So if we want to prove such a statement in a higher order theorem prover using a resolution method, then you of course as a first step, you negate the conjecture, because resolution proofs are by contradiction. So you negate, and then you want to derive an empty clause, so a basic contradiction. That's what we are doing now. So we negate the conjecture, and then we do clause normalization. So we want to end up with clauses. So a structure in clause normal form. And we do that here by pushing the negation over these quantifiers. So that flips the quantifiers, that becomes an existential one. This becomes a universal one. And then in the next step here, we can introduce this column constant for the existentially quantified variable. And we can remove the universal quantified variable and take this universal quantification as implicit. We search now for solutions for h that contradict this formula, so to say. We continue with clause normalization, and we end up with these two clauses here. C1, P of h of f of s, and C2, not P of f of h of s. Again, so simply f and h are reversed. And you see, we can now resolve. They are of opposite polarity, the clauses here, and we can infer the empty clause if we can solve the unification problem assigned to it, this unification problem. And now is the point here that shows you an intrinsic problem of higher order reasoning. Unification is undecidable in general and even infinitary. So here you see that because you have an infinite number of instances for f. Of course, they all do it here, so you could stop after the first one. But generally, if you interleave here unification with more complex proof search, then you don't know whether you can stop or whether you just have to take the next unifier and continue with proof search and so on. But fortunately, that not so often occurs in practice in problems in mathematics, even in complicated ones. Even in Cantas' theorem, you are not suffering from these aspects to the extent that you couldn't find proofs very effectively. So unification in Hall might, on the other hand, be again further complicated if you consider the Boolean extensionality principle. Consider these two clauses here, Q of A and B. Now you have a formula under this predicate Q. And here you have nearly the same formula, but you've just switched the order of the conjuncts here. And of course, I mean, you immediately see that you could resolve here, but now you have to solve a unification problem modulo the entire theory of higher order logic in the end. So that makes it also very complicated. These are challenges to pick up: primitive substitution, unification, and this interaction with Boolean extensionality still in order to make progress in higher order automation. And here's the primitive substitution principle explained a little bit more deeply. So for instance, here you see a conjecture: for all x, for all y, there exists an R, not R of xy. So there exists a relation so that x and y are not in that relation. We again try to prove that conjecture. We negate it. We get the quantifiers moved inside. That flips again the quantifiers. We can do colimization again here. You see we introduce these constant terms s and t. We get rid of the double negation, and we end up with a single clause in the search space of the theorem prover. No other clause to resolve against. So actually, if you don't have a further rule to apply here, then you would stop at that point. And that illustrates you why you need an additional rule, in this case, to come up with a solution. Because there is a solution. Just instantiate R with the empty set. This is a relation which doesn't relate x and y. So that does the thing. And well, this is the guessing step. The empty set can be guessed by guessing a little bit of logical structure at top position. Yeah, if you have a negation symbol in the signature, you can do it with this one. If you don't, then you have to first introduce a negation symbol and continue a little bit with further steps. But this is what I mean by heuristic guessing of some kind of logical structure that is needed in the system. And here you see the need for that, because if you do that, then you of course immediately come up with, after beta normalization, with the empty clause, and you have done your proof. And if you look at that example and you consider the more general flavor of that, then you see that we have to apply clause normalization in higher order theorem proving over and over again generally. Whenever you do a primitive substitution step, guess a little bit of logical structure, you might not be clause normal anymore. You might have to do normalizations again to end up with clauses. So primitive substitution is a key to automation of Cantas' theorem. The diagonal set is actually the negation symbol at top position guessed by this operation. But it can, provers can deal very effectively with that and solve it in a second or two. And we also had success with primitive substitution, and that was a big surprise when we looked in computational metaphysics in studies of the ontological argument for the existence of God. So here you see a paper, Ichkai paper, which I wrote with my colleague Bruno Watson-Logel-Paleo, in which we showed that theorem prover Leo 2 was automatically telling us, to our surprise, that Gödel's scriptum of his ontological argument actually contained a flaw, and that was leading to inconsistency. And the key step in the proof delivered by Leo was also a primitive substitution step. However, we also verified Dana-Scott's variant of Gödel's proof and showed that this is all fine and consistent. So now I come to these last parts. In the last 15 minutes or 20 minutes I have to spend here. They will be much shorter. And the first one is now about non-classical logic. So why is classical logic actually not enough? Well, here's an example. The problem has to do, for example, with modalities. Knowledge is such a modality. Peter knows New York is a city in the US. Assume Peter is living in New York, and of course he knows it's a city in the US. So that's a fact in the world. So we have a fact, New York is a city in the US. But there are more facts like these. So there's also a city in Turkey that's called Batman. So that means now, because both of these statements are true, in a classical setting, in a truth functional setting, they are equivalent, they are equal, and in the truth functional modeling of knowledge, we can now replace equals by equals, and we can infer from the upper statement that we have Peter knows Batman is a city in Turkey, which is of course nuts. Why should he know that when he knows the upper statement? So this is not an appropriate modeling of knowledge. And in fact, the problem here is that we have a truth functional modeling assumed here of knowledge. And what we want to do is we want to block this replacement here. and we want to evaluate formulas not statically as we do in classical logic, but we want to evaluate formulas like we do in cryptic semantics for particular possible words. So we might want to say New York is a city just in our current world, but eventually we can think of alternative worlds in which this is not the case. And eventually we can think of other alternative worlds in which Batman is not a city in Turkey. This is exactly what modal logic does. It introduces now new logic operators with an enriched semantics of the entire logic setup that allows you to distinguish between different possible words in which you evaluate the formulas, and that blocks this kind of replacement we have seen up there. And you want to support now many different notions of modalities. You want to eventually support belief, time, obligation, eventually all of them at the same time in practical applications. And there are many other non-classical logics beside the modal logics I've motivated now here. And what you in general needs is combinations of non-classical logics. So the challenge question that's now deriving from this investigation is, how can we actually tame this expanding logic zoo? So since a century or more, we see many, many new logics being developed, and it's still continuing. So many, many non-classical logics being developed over and over again. So that brings me now to the second last part of the presentation, universal logical reasoning. Why classical logic actually is enough. And you see it here in one of our papers, the Leo theorem prover, the third version, Leo 3. We write here in the abstract, in addition, the prover natively supports almost every normal higher order modal logic. So it's a prover for classical higher order logic, but it also supports all other or almost every normal higher order modal logic. So how will we do that? I want to explain that to you now. So how to tame the logic zoo? The first thing you want to do when you want to get the hands on a new non-classical logic, let's stay with modal logics here for the sake of this talk, then you want to look in a book that tells you all about this logic. So the syntax and the semantics. And when you open such a book, like a handbook here, then you find a description of the syntax of that logic in a meta language, typically an informal meta language. And if you go a few pages further, you see an introduction of the semantics of that logic, again, using that meta language. The meta language, typically a combination of informal language and formal language, so formal content like notions of sets you see appearing there, relations, and so on. So how about the following idea? How about replacing this informal meta language or this matheral meta language, a combination of natural language and mathematical language, by a formal language, a fully formal language? How about replacing it by our higher order logic? And that is exactly the approach we have been following. And we there strive for very elegant modelings of these object logics we are interested in, modal logics in this case here, in the meta logic hall. You see it here, meta logic hall in blue, and the idea is now to characterize the logic in red in terms of the logic in blue. So we are after some very simple equations, ideally non-recursive, no inductive structures, very simple characterization of the logic in red, the constant and logical symbols of the logic in red in terms of the meta logic. So to show that the logic in red is a subset or proper sub-language, so to say, of the logic in blue. That is what we are after. We call that shallow semantical embeddings. And we also are interested in metalogical notions to be encoded this way. That gives you the abstract story. Here's a set of concrete equations to look at. I don't have much time left, but I think I can still motivate it. So you have here the language in red, propositional modal logic, so propositional symbols, negation, disjunction, and the box operator. So think about knowledge operator, for example, as I have motivated. And here you have the characterization of the semantics, a Kripke-style semantics, or relational semantics. And the equations we have come up now with for propositional modal logics are very simple. associate the propositional P, the symbols P of the red logic with predicates in the higher order logic. The predicates allow us now to consider this type I as possible words, and the application of such a predicate to a particular term denoting a possible word tells you whether this P holds for that word or not. So we talk explicitly about possible words. That's the idea here. And then we simply have to lift the other operators, negation, disjunction, and the box operator accordingly. So they operate now on these lifted predicates, so the predicates that are characterizing the propositions of the logic in red. And that's a very obvious thing here. Give me a formula phi of that predicate type and return the set of all words such that not phi holds in that word. That's the way you can read it, and analogously the others. And you can also introduce a notion of validity. Formula phi is valid, whether for all generally valid or globally valid, when for all words W holds, phi is true in W. So this simple set of equations allows you to model the language in red and the language in blue, modal logic for base modal logic K in classical higher logic. But you can even extend it now for quantified modal logics. And for making this happen, we have found, and that's a novel contribution here, we have found a way to actually come up with these characterizations of these pi operators, which allow you to introduce universal quantification as syntactic sugar, and to give that also such an associated reading in the language in blue. I don't dive into the details here, that would be too much for the remaining time, but you see here the example that gives you the flavor of what we do. We can now formulate problems using the language in red, take the definitions we have provided, also hand them over to the theorem prover, and let the theorem prover unfold this definition. So for instance, the for all x p of x is just syntactic sugar for this here. I have talked about it. Now we can unfold the definition of pi, just as we have it up there. That introduces this lambda term, as you see here. And this is applied to the argument term here. Now we do better reductions, we end up with this term. Now we unfold the definition of the box operator, and do better reduction. So we end up here. And now we unfold the notion of validity, and we end up here. And all this is done automatically by the theorem provers. We don't have to care about it. We just have to give these equations to the theorem provers. In fact, they are just saying that these are just syntactic sugar for these terms in blue. Okay. And you can do that now very elegantly in existing proof assistance systems. This here is the encoding of what I have just shown you in a few lines of code in the proof assistance system Isabelle Hall. So this is the encoding of the logic, in this case, a higher order modal logic S5. Some lemmata being proved here, so making sure that we're really in the S5 logic. And then on the right-hand side, you see the complete encoding of Gödel's ontological argument in this logic S5. It's just a few lines of axioms, even very readable syntax here, if you compare it with the original writings. And then you have here the automation of the proof with the internal theorem provers of the Isabelle Hall systems in a few seconds, completely automated. So with a few lines of formal codes, you can enter into novel applications here in computational metaphysics. You have an excellent degree of automations in many cases. We were able to fully automate Gödel's ontological arguments and many others. And you're still intuitive and readable by philosophers. So that's interesting. So here are some suggestions for further reading. So what we are actually doing here is the following. We're interested in an application area, say computational metaphysics. We deal in this area with non-classical logics, say higher order modal logics are relevant in this area. Instead of automating directly, we embed them in higher order logic and reuse now existing technology. In the case you have seen the Isabelle Hall system. These systems often give you access to powerful automation in the background. So Isabelle Hall offers you a system called Sledgehammer that connects to the world-leading theorem proving systems and automatically transforms the input problems to them. So it cooperates with the higher order provers Leo and Zetalax. It cooperates with first order provers like Spass, Vampire, or with SMT solvers like CBC4 and Z3. Or you might call counter model finders that try to attack the conjectures you do and show you the errors you have made, or show that it's not valid by computing a counter model. And there are also systems available like Nitpick or Nunchaku. And you see in the end, many of these systems actually cooperate internally with that technology. Now you can easily move to another application domain. So for instance, with the same setup, we do now also experiments in category theory. Here we take another non-classical logic, free logic. Or we go in the area of machine ethics, ethico-legal reasoning. That's what I spent the last 5 minutes on. And use deontic logics, non-classical logics that allow you to talk about obligation and permission. And you reuse the same technology. You don't have to change anything except the equations you provide the system to. So that's a wonderful environment because it uniformly supports research, education, and application. So last 5 minutes, I want to spend on this application direction here, ethical-legal governance for artificial intelligence. I find this poster here wonderful. So that's a movie, an old one you probably know from 1954 with James Dean. The original title is Rebel Without a Cause. In German, it has a nice title, Denn sie wissen nicht what they do. Then they don't know what they do. And I like that so much because I see here a certain kind of analogy of the problems with this young generation, rising generation, which is characterized by kind of directionlessness and normative directionlessness in the movie, with the current rise of eventually, at some point, autonomous AI technology. Because we might now ask the question, do our current AI systems on the rise, in particular in direction of fully autonomous one, know what they are doing? Do we know what we are doing when we actually address such AI systems with increasingly critical decisions about everyday life? Is normative directionlessness and unpredictability a core character of this generation of future AI systems? So how can we actually control such systems? I think these are really relevant questions we have to pay attention to, because we are now laying the foundations for the future in this regard. And my personal view on that is pretty much inspired here by publications like you see here by Daniel Kahneman, or this one I even like more, by Jonathan Haidt, The Emotional Dog and Its Rational Tail. And in these papers and books in psychology or moral psychology, you find a distinction depicted between an intuitive, very fast decision-making layers in human, which is has a kind of counterplayer, an upper layer counterplayer, a slow layer, a rational decision layer, a rational justification layer, typically applied often only post hoc. And in these papers, you find different models being discussed about how these layers interact. Well, one is obviously tempted here to eventually draw an analogy to the field of AI. So we have eventually techniques on the side of subsymbolic AI, more to be characterized as these fast, imperfect systems, which are reacting eventually emotional and eventually slightly erratic, but they are fast and have excellent performance. And then we have this slow, or way more slow, rational, but precise layer of symbolic AI techniques. And the proposal we have made now, recently published in AI Journal, is to work towards an architecture like this here. So take any kind of technology, be it subsymbolic or symbolic, as an AI reasoner here in yellow, as the intuitive fast layer, eventually a combination of those. And it's reacting to input it gets from its own environment in blue or from the outside via perception. And its task is to perform some actions in a particular domain. It has some task, it has some domain it knows, and is supposed to come up with a next action to execute. But at least for the critical actions, we propose here a second layer justification, or a second intermediate layer. This suggested action has to pass before it can be executed. And this upper layer is now concerned with checking whether the suggested action is actually in line, compliant with some kind of declaratively stated, by humans stated, ethical norms and legal theory. And only if these very critical action suggestions can parse this additional check, they should be executed. That's the proposal here. And that would actually provide a basis for verification and explanation, and actually an approach that would be independent of the AI black box level itself. It doesn't have to look into the black box. It just has to know about the action, eventually the reasons that have triggered these actions to being suggested. And as I said, we just want to focus here on the very assessment of very critical actions in critical application domains. These proposals are not new. So proposals in direction of ethical legal governance, and you see some of them listed here. So that brings me to the very end of this presentation. I want to point here with my second last slide to some recent work that, if you're interested in this direction, you might just want to have a look at. For instance, in this recent AI journal paper, we provide a Lógica framework and methodology for ethical and legal reasoning based on the technology I've just introduced. And there's also a data set available with some concrete examples you might just download and further develop on your own. And there are associated papers which present some of these data sets. So for instance, we have done checked arguments in climate engineering. We have done some modeling of ethical theories, the ontological theories, and most recent work, that's probably the most interesting one to look at, an encoding of legal balancing in law. So that's very recent work, and I can for those of you really interested in that direction, that's probably the most interesting piece to look at the moment. Well, this is, I'm at the end of my talk, 3 minutes over time. I've introduced the universal logical reasoning approach in Hall that works surprisingly well. Because of the elegance of these equations I've shown you, but also because of the progress we have made on both in automation of higher order logic and the integration of higher order logic in interactive proof assistance systems. And that enables actually many novel applications, as I have motivated, and I've just shown you a few of them. Just pointed to those in computational metaphysics and mentioned ethical legal reasoning in the end, but didn't show you really a lot about it. And this is a very interesting area here, also a challenging one, pluralistic ethical legal reasoning in order to control AI systems. That's a particular thing I want to go after in the next couple of years. And that requires further research and investment in logic embeddings in Hall, in logic, in combinations of logic embeddings in Hall, in automated theorem proving and model finding for Hall, in the development and further improvement of proof assistance for Hall, and of course in education and training of a new generation of people in the field. And the next envisioned challenge would now really be to look with the universal logical reasoning approach I've depicted into an interaction between machine learning techniques, neural techniques that give you a better grasp on intuition and fast reasoning and pattern finding, eventually also to guide the problems I've pointed to with primitive substitution and so on, and see how that can be fruitfully put into interaction with this deliberative and precise logic-based approach as I have depicted. So that brings me to the end. I thank you very much, and I'm looking now forward to questions and discussion.
Talk. I think there are many things that we can discuss about this talk. I would have one right at the beginning. So you show that you can encode logic into higher order logic, or several different kinds of logic into higher order logic, and then you can encode so that a system like Isabel can solve the resulting new encoding. But when you receive the proof, what about readability? Because you have a first description of the problem, then you go to another, which is probably bigger description, and then another much bigger. It's like compiling a language into assembler, and then you get the final proof is in that assembler. Is that still readable?
So the answer is yes and no, both at the same time. I mentioned that there's further research needed. And I also showed you examples on when you do it the combined way with combining interaction and automation. I go to that slide. I couldn't go into the details. And I show you the slide of the Cantas, the proof of Cantas theorem. Where was that? A bit further down. That is already too far. And then we can talk better about it.
Yeah, but we cannot see your slides, so you have to do it with your hands.
Ah, okay, they are not visible anymore because it still tells me they're shared. Okay, then I have to answer it. Now you can see.
Now they are shared, yeah.
Ah, that's interesting. Okay, it's just the size of the window determines of whether you can see that or not. Interesting. So when I find the slide here again where I showed you this example, that was earlier on. No, it was later on. It was after introduction of universal logical reasoning. Just give me a second here. Let me go to full screen mode with that. After these presentations here. Yeah. Full screen mode. You see, here, this is a call of the system, external system Leo2. Leo2 proves that statement in higher order modal logic about the existence of Gödel's ontological argument very quickly. And what it returns then is information. That is a very technical proof Leo derives there. That's of course, and that is something that only expert can probably well read and interpret. But there's now an interesting interaction going on with the Isabelle-Hall system. So Leo, actually, the proof of Leo can be analyzed. It could be looked into, and you could now find out about what are the exact assumptions that are being used. What are even the instantiations that are being used. There's more research needed in this area, but there are already clever mechanisms in Isabelle-Hall that can extract such informations or try to reconstruct it themselves. For instance, here, it finds out that the following axioms, so here in this case, nearly all of them, and definitions are needed. That is already very interesting information for the user. So the call to Leo returns this here to you in the interface. Call an internal method called Metis with these assumptions, and that should do the job. Now, there are techniques provided in proof assistants like Isabelle-Hall and others, and we have also done research in that already very early on, end of the 90s and beginning and shortly after, in the reconstruction of such proofs in a human intuitive style. In a style that's very good readable to humans. And in the talk, we have also seen something like that. That was the proof of Cantas theorem. I have to switch there. So that could be now followed by an attempt to reconstruct from these suggestions here. That is what you essentially need. Then a style and more AI technology being applied, reconstruct the proof at a human intuitive layer. And that's exactly research that's currently being done in these systems to connect these automated theorem provers with their unreadable proofs in tableau calculi, in superposition calculi, in resolution calculi into very readable styles in a system like Isabelle-Hall. And if I find it, I can go back and show you this style as it is presented for Cantas.
No, I think that's there are other questions. So I think that's
okay. Yeah, I shouldn't spend so long, but I leave the slide. People can just look at that, and then you have a few steps in which you then go step by step through this proof, and this is readable.
Okay, so there is a question about uncertain reasoning when you are not sure. When you say with a probability of something, I believe this. So how do you encode that? Can you encode that in?
Yeah, probabilistic reasoning is on the list of where we need further studies. What we have already done is, let's say, mathematical fuzzy logic or multi-valued logic. So we have embedded 16-valued logics, but I think here is something else meant with notion of probabilistic reasoning, and there's more to look into. But as soon as you have a framework which you describe in terms of an set theoretic semantics, and that is often what we see in papers, then this description of a framework in terms of this depiction of what set theoretic semantics is then the key for me to actually come up with the equations for that. So if someone has a concrete proposal where he thinks that can't be done, should just challenge us, and that would be then an interesting next topic for a student thesis. But I can tell you already, as soon as you have a proper set theoretic characterization of that logic, then of course the technology I've shown you, which is just based on this elegant support for sets and relations in classical higher order logic, should kick in and should allow me to come up after some kind of deep thinking with the right equations that do the job. So we have done that for many, many different logics already, neighborhood semantics logics, as I said, many valued. But for the area of probabilistic reasoning, we haven't just spent too much resources into it yet, and should do that.
Okay, so another question is the following. So you have been active in the field of ethics for AI in Europe. So the question is, what's the status about the ethical regulations of AI in Europe? Are there any ethical regulations? Are they being discussed? What's the current state of that discussion?
I think it's an ongoing discussion, and you see it being brought on the table in many of the papers, recommendation papers that have been prepared on national level, German national AI recommendations, or the European AI regulations, that there should be more resources put into this direction. And I think that is actually what is needed now, but I'm not aware of now, let's say, many regulatory texts that I could, for instance, directly use for encoding here. We have done some work on the GDPR. There is interesting research projects just being granted in Luxembourg, for example, where we propose to look into texts like the GDPR. But I think now for controlling AI systems, we need more such concrete regulations. And my proposal here would be to eventually work hand in hand with lawmakers from the very beginning, so that you not in the end up with this challenge problem of interpreting natural language, but you develop natural language descriptions intended for human consumption in parallel with associated representations eventually in a suitable formal logic setting. And if you could achieve that would be wonderful, because then you have something for the humans and something to be put in machinery to be tested for claims as I've made here. So that would be wonderful if we could go that direction. I haven't, there is emerging regulation, but I don't know those exact pieces for regulating AI systems, which I would get my hands on now directly. But we try to keep the eyes open. If there are people in the audience here who have further suggestions in that direction, I'm happy to take any emails or pointers to these pieces of legislations that are relevant and interesting in the direction I have motivated.
Okay, I have another question about mathematics. So in the last years, there have been several proofs in mathematics which are very long and very difficult to verify, so that you let the computer verify the proof. How is the state of standardizing the language for encoding mathematical proofs so that the computer can verify the proofs?
Yeah, this is, of course, still a challenge debate. What is the right foundation here to start with? Is it the logic I've just presented, which is simply type lambda calculus as a basis polymorphic extension of it, and then put the logic on top of it? Or do we need something like dependent types? Do we need something like constructive type theory, which is the foundation of for instance, a Coq system? Do we need new formalisms supporting univalent foundations, for example? So there's a strong debate going on, and this is an interesting debate also. Now, my interest so that makes it, of course, complicated for what you just have said. So there are people who are doing formalizations now and take a different foundations than another group. And the big question, of course, arises, is that in the end all compatible? And this is, of course, a challenge question. For instance, also in Kepler's and development of Kepler's proof, I'm not an expert, so I wasn't part of the team here, but I know a little bit about it. And as far as I remember, initially they also worked with different proof assistance systems, which had slightly different foundations, even very close foundations, but it was hard to integrate these pieces into each other. So that is an area where definitely we need to look more into it. It's an interesting area. But at the same time, with the approach I have shown you here, I mentioned also our experiments in direction of category theory, or I mentioned this view on foundations in metaphysics. That might be also an interesting solution to actually mediate proofs from different angles on the foundation side. But this is also something where we would have to put more resources, and I don't have time to follow all of these interesting directions. But I think this approach could also give you eventually a potential interesting angle, research angle on this question, on what are the right foundations to start with. And actually at the moment, a PhD student of mine is looking into starting with the logic like classical higher logic, encoding in that logic, then, for instance, Boolean algebra, then taking again Boolean algebra as a basis for further foundational work, or the other direction we are doing with category theory built on top, encoded on top of classical higher logic. And our question there is, can we again encode classical higher logic in category theory? So you see that in the end, the answer would be it's not so relevant in the end with where you actually start with. Take those foundation which is expressive enough and well supported in practice, so it has the best proof automation. But it's a very interesting area. How can we support these different proof formalizations that are currently going on, and how can we mediate in the end the construction of proofs that are being done in different communities there?
Okay. So I have also another question. So you mentioned the competitions which are held every year for the theorem provers. Can you explain how such a competition happens? What do the theorem provers have to prove, and how are they compared?
Yeah, I have to apologize that I couldn't put on the URL system on TPTP. That is what people have to look at, or the tptp.org infrastructure. So this is maintained in Miami by Jeff Sutcliffe. He is the master of the competitions in automated theorem proving, not just higher order, also first order, for many, many years. And in that infrastructure, so it's www.tptp.org, you find all information about that, and you can even play with the systems. You also find the benchmarks that are being used every year. And it works as follows. So you take a big benchmark, a pool of benchmark problems, and you make a selection, a sub-selection of that, and that enters the competition each year. There are new problems coming in. Otherwise, it would become boring. Systems would just learn exactly, or you could do very clever, probably machine learning if you just have a static set of problems. Or just table the entire set of problems if you want so. But therefore, there are every year coming new problems in. Everybody is invited to submit problems. Then the theorem provers actually are asked to, for instance, solve, say, 300 problems in a particular category. Say exactly the logic I have introduced, which is called TPTP THF category in the TPTP world. And then you're asked to solve 300, 500 problems. And for each problem, you get a certain time out, say 60 seconds or 90 seconds. You don't know in advance. Also, that is kind of randomly selected at competition time. And then, of course, in the end, the prover wins who delivers most solved theorems together with a proof object. So together with an object which you can potentially verify. And this is roughly the depiction of the setup of the championships. And people who are interested to join, they have to build a Theorem prover that can accept the problems in that particular language supported, called TPTP THF language for higher order logic. There are also formats for first order. If you can read them in, then your task will be to process them. I showed you a little bit of resolution proofs, and to memorize a proof object, or to spit somehow out a proof object in the end that justifies why that is a proof, and which could be manually or even automatically checked by other machinery. We don't do automatic checks yet, but that would also be possible in the future once you standardize also proof output. So that's roughly the depiction. But as I said, go to www.tptp.org and you find all the information about the competitions, and also the results of the competition since its very beginnings.
Okay, so I think we don't have more questions, but since you talked about the competitions and maybe some of the students hearing this talk would be interested in joining such a competition, can you recommend a textbook in this area that people can use as a first stepping stone in order to understand this field?
Yeah, there are a couple of textbooks. Of course, I mean, you have to read textbooks on first order or higher order logic to know about the theory you are dealing with. But then more on the practical side, a good textbook by John Harrison, for instance. He's the developer of the Light proof assistant, and he has written a textbook on automated reasoning. So this is one that I can very much recommend from a practical perspective. You find even some fragments of code in there. It's not so much, whether the automation part is so much addressing the higher order automation, but it provides you lots of machinery that's relevant. And I think it became clear in the talk as well that when you want to write a good higher order Theorem prover, you should, of course, be capable also to deal with first order and propositional logic, or to include or cooperate with systems who handle these fragments well, because you're always interested in pushing formulas eventually in these other formats, and then having specialist systems supporting your higher order reasoner. And that textbook actually has many interesting techniques presented inside, and there might be more. So if one of my colleagues is now thinks I forgot to mention something, please apologize.
So what was the title again?
It has automated reasoning in the title, I think. Practical automated reasoning. I don't know.
Practical automated reasoning by Harrison.
The person who actually developed the Light proof assistant system. Easy to find. He has been with Intel for a long time. I think he's now with Amazon.
Okay.
Also, working in practice, yeah.
Okay, so very good. So thank you very much, Christoph. Thank you to everybody who followed this talk. And the next talk in this colloquium will be held next month, in 4 weeks, the last Wednesday of every month. And it will be someone who is going to talk about the work being done at IBM in this field of artificial intelligence. So thank you again, Christoph. Thank you, everybody. And we say goodbye.
Goodbye.